That night, in the company lobby after the anniversary gala, my stepmother slammed her fist into my collarbone, right beneath the coat rack. My father glanced over, his voice a low growl. Not in public. He didn't tell her to stop, only not to do it where people could see. I didn't cry. I opened my phone's recording app, stared directly at the ceiling-mounted security camera, and thought, in public is the perfect place for this. My name is Rhea Vale. At 32, I serve as the Chief Compliance Officer for Gray Line Meridian, a position that sounds far more intimidating than it feels. In reality, it's a job about rules, about making sure the lines are drawn in ink, not sand. And on this particular evening, the lines were about to be redrawn in blood. The gala was over. The grand ballroom on the 28th floor, once a glittering constellation of champagne flutes and forced laughter, was now a ghost of its former self. The air, thick with the ghosts of expensive perfume and ambition, was slowly being cleared by the building's industrial-grade HVAC system. Most of the guests, the investors, the board members, the city's financial elite, had already descended in the silent, express elevators, leaving behind a skeleton crew of event staff and a few lingering executives too important to leave early. The lighting had been dimmed to a warm, amber glow, the kind that was meant to be forgiving, to soften the edges of a long night. It cast long, distorted shadows across the marble floors, making the cavernous lobby feel both intimate and unsettling. I stood near the service exit, speaking in low tones to the head of the events team, a harried-looking man named Marcus, whose tie was already loosened. We were going over the preliminary invoices, a mundane, end-of-night ritual for me. It was in the small print, the line items for specialty floral arrangements and audiovisual consulting, where the real stories of corporate excess were written. I was in my element, the quiet hum of the building a familiar soundtrack to my work. That's when I felt her presence, a sudden drop in the ambient temperature. Sable Rowan, my father's wife of 18 months, was approaching. She didn't walk. She moved with the predatory grace of a creature that has never had to hurry. Her heels, impossibly thin, clicked against the marble with a sound like ice cracking. She was wearing a crimson gown that seemed to absorb the amber light, leaving her at the center of a small pocket of darkness. I kept my eyes on the tablet in my hands, feigning preoccupation with a charge for 24 extra oyster platters. Marcus, we'll need to cross-reference this with the initial catering contract, I said, my voice steady. Sable stopped directly in front of me, blocking my view of the nervous event manager. She said nothing for a moment, letting the silence stretch, a tactic she favored. I could smell the champagne on her, a sweet, cloying scent mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of her perfume. Don't ruin my evening with your spreadsheets, Rhea, she finally said. Her voice was a low, smoky purr, the kind men found captivating. I found it exhausting. Before I could formulate a placidly professional response, her hand moved. It wasn't a slap or a push. She flung her valet keycard at me. The sharp plastic corner struck me squarely in the chest, a small, hard impact that was more insulting than painful. It clattered to the floor between my feet. Pick it up, she commanded. I didn't move. I looked from the keycard on the floor up to her face. Her eyes, a pale, cold blue, were narrowed. A faint flush of alcohol and anger colored her high cheekbones. I'm not your assistant. Sable, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That was the mistake. Or perhaps it was the intention. Her reaction was immediate and volcanic. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of my dress and the skin beneath. She dragged me the few steps toward the large, ornate coat rack near the lobby's main seating area. It was a heavy, wrought iron monstrosity, currently draped with a few forgotten cashmere and leather coats. The air around it was thick with the scent of damp wool and expensive leather. You think you're so clever, she hissed, her face close to mine. With your rules and your reports, you're nothing but a glorified bean counter, living off your father's name. And then she struck me. It wasn't a wild, flailing hit. It was a calculated, precise blow, the heel of her palm driving directly into my right collarbone. A starburst of white-hot pain exploded from the point of impact, radiating down my arm and up my neck. The force of it slammed me back against the unyielding iron of the coat rack. My head connected with a metal hook with a dull thud, and for a second, the amber lights of the lobby fractured into 1,000 glittering shards. The world went silent, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. Through the haze of pain, I saw my father, Grant Vale, the CEO of this company, standing not 20 feet away. He had been in conversation with our chief financial officer, a man whose loyalty was as flexible as his stock options. He had seen the whole thing. He didn't move toward us. He didn't raise his voice. His eyes, the same gray as my own, didn't even register shock. They scanned the lobby, noting the handful of remaining witnesses. Marcus from the events team, who was frozen in place, 2 junior associates pretending to be absorbed in their phones, a security guard near the elevator bank, his hand hovering uncertainly over his radio. Then my father's gaze met mine. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated annoyance. He looked at Sable, his hand-picked COO, and his voice, when it came, was a low, serrated growl, meant only for her ears, but in the sudden quiet, it carried. Not in public. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't ask if I was all right. He didn't condemn the violence. His only criticism was of the venue. The act was acceptable. The audience was not. A strange, cold clarity washed over me, cutting through the pain. The ringing in my ears subsided. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The years of quiet slights, of being sidelined and patronized, of watching this woman dismantle the company's ethics from the inside with my father's blessing, all coalesced into this single, sharp moment. This was not an escalation. This was a gift. My movements were slow, deliberate. I pushed myself off the coat rack, my shoulders screaming in protest. Sable had stepped back, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. She believed she had won. She believed she had put the compliance girl in her place. I ignored her. I walked to the low leather bench that ran along the wall. My purse was there. I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I swiped open the screen, my thumb finding the familiar icon of the audio recording app I had placed on my home screen 3 months ago. I pressed record. A small, red dot appeared in the corner of the screen, a silent, blinking heartbeat. I placed the phone's screen down on the bench, its microphone pointing into the open space. The app's timestamp was automatically synced with the building's network time protocol server, the same server that timestamped every frame of the security footage. I looked up, past my father's rigid back, past Sable's smug face, to the small, dark dome of the security camera mounted on the ceiling. It was a wide-angle lens, perfectly positioned to capture the entire lobby entrance, including the coat rack. I held its unblinking gaze. Then I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at my father and his wife. I spoke, but my voice was so low it was almost a thought, a private declaration in a very public space. In public is best. The security guard, a young man named Leo, whose name I had made a point to learn, finally broke his paralysis. He hurried over, his face etched with concern and confusion. "Ms. Vale, are you all right? Should I call someone?" "I'm fine. Leo," I said, my voice regaining its normal, measured tone. He offered me a small, instant ice pack from the first aid kit at his station, cracking it to activate the cold. I took it from him, the plastic crinkling in the quiet. My fingers curled around the sudden, intense cold, but I made no move to place it on my collarbone. I let it rest in my hand, a cold stone. I wanted the bruise. I wanted the redness to deepen, for the capillaries to burst and bloom under the skin. I wanted a visible, undeniable record of this moment, a photograph written in tissue and blood. Sable scoffed and turned away, dismissing the entire affair. My father had already resumed his conversation with the CFO, acting as if nothing had happened, a master of corporate denial. But I knew something had shifted. A lock had been turned. In my mind, I started counting backward, running through the checklist I had been building for over a year. The encrypted server I'd set up in the guest apartment my father had so generously provided. The carefully worded clauses I had inserted into the company's expense and conduct policies. Clauses Sable had signed without reading. The whistleblower reports I had cultivated and protected. The chain of custody for the documents I had copied. It was all there. A meticulously constructed weapon waiting to be fired. I had built the entire mechanism, piece by piece. All I was missing was the trigger. I needed one final, irrefutable piece of evidence. Something public, something violent, something that could not be dismissed as a private family matter. My collarbone throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. I looked at the red dot I knew was blinking on my phone's screen. I looked at the dark eye of the camera on the ceiling. 2 more pieces, now locked in place. The machine was complete, and as Sable's laughter echoed from across the lobby, I knew she had just loaded the gun and handed it to me. The cold from the ice pack in my hand was a sharp, grounding sensation, a stark contrast to the throbbing heat blooming across my collarbone. From the corner of my eye, I could see the last of the senior partners making their discreet exits, their gazes carefully averted. They had seen, or they had heard, and they had all made the same calculation. Involvement was a liability. My father, Grant Vale, stood with his back to me, a granite statue of willful ignorance, his voice a low, steady murmur as he continued his discussion about quarterly earnings. It was a masterful performance. To anyone just arriving, he was simply a CEO wrapping up a successful evening. To me, he was a man meticulously polishing the frame of a picture that was already on fire. This whole charade began 18 months ago. Not with a merger or an acquisition, but with a wedding, a tasteful, understated affair at a vineyard estate, all white roses and string quartets. And then, almost before the ink on the marriage certificate was dry, the announcement came. Sable Rowan, my new stepmother, was appointed Greyline Meridian's interim chief operating officer. The press release was a masterpiece of corporate spin. Extolling the virtues of a unified leadership family, it was a move, the statement cooed, that would ensure seamless strategic alignment from the boardroom to the home. In reality, it was a coronation disguised as a corporate restructuring. The local paper, the Norcrest Gazette, ran a fawning feature. The centerpiece was a photo of my father and Sable standing on the steps of the Braxton Point building, our company's gleaming steel and glass headquarters. He was pinning a corsage to the lapel of her tailored suit, his head bent in a gesture of manufactured intimacy, a smile of proprietary pride on his face. She was looking directly at the camera, her expression one of cool, serene ownership. They looked like power. They looked like stability. They looked like a family that had it all figured out. The headline read, Vale and Rowan, a partnership for Norcrest's future. It was brilliant PR. It was also a complete fabrication. My own seamless alignment came in the form of an eviction notice. 2 weeks after Sable's appointment, my desk was moved from the 29th floor executive wing to a smaller office on the 27th. The official reason, delivered by a tight-lipped HR representative, was a desire to avoid any potential for familial conflict of interest. It was a transparently flimsy excuse. My role as Chief Compliance Officer was, by design, adversarial to unchecked power. Removing me from the executive floor wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about ensuring Sable wouldn't have to look at the person whose job it was to watch her. My new office was sterile and quiet, with a view of a neighboring building's air conditioning units. The message was clear. I was no longer part of the inner circle. Sable wasted no time in leveraging her new power. Her first major initiative was the creation of a cultural expenses task force. Its stated mission was to enhance employee wellness and foster a dynamic corporate environment. Its actual purpose was to serve as her personal slush fund, the wellness budget. Once a modest allocation for gym memberships and mental health resources ballooned, suddenly there were team-building offsites to boutique wineries in Napa, strategic planning sessions at 5-star spas in Arizona, and lavish cultural appreciation dinners at restaurants where the wine list had its own table of contents. These events were attended by a small, hand-picked court of Sable's sycophants. The rest of the company got a memo about a new brand of artisanal coffee in the break room. I brought my concerns to my father. I showed him the expense reports, the invoices that lacked proper itemization, the guest lists that were suspiciously light on actual employees. I laid out the clear pattern of abuse. He listened, his fingers steepled under his chin, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, he sighed, a sound of weary disappointment, as if I were a child who had failed to grasp a simple concept. "Rhea, you're being too harsh," he said, his voice laced with paternal condescension. "Sable is trying to build morale. We need harmony right now. The optics are good. Let's not disrupt the narrative." Harmony, that was his mantra. He was a man obsessed with surface tension. As long as the water in the glass looked still, he refused to acknowledge the shark circling beneath. He lived and died by the bold-faced numbers on a quarterly report and the glowing quotes in a press release. My detailed, evidence-backed warnings were just noise, an unwelcome disruption to the beautiful, profitable peace he believed he had bought. He and Sable fundamentally misunderstood me. They looked at me and saw a stereotype they could manage, but I am not the quiet, deferential daughter they expected. I am an American woman who was raised on grocery store coupons and a dog-eared copy of the Fair Labor Standards Act. My mother, before she died, was a union organizer. I didn't grow up in country clubs. I grew up watching her fight for overtime pay for factory workers. I learned about contracts and loopholes at the dinner table. I understand that rules are not suggestions. They are the only thing that protects the powerless from the powerful. My father's fortune was built on my grandfather's grit, but he had long since forgotten the taste of it. I hadn't. Sable, in her casual cruelty, took to calling me the compliance girl. She would do it in management meetings, a dismissive wave of her hand accompanying the words, "Let's run this by the compliance girl. Make sure we're not breaking any of her little rules." It was a calculated move to diminish my authority, to frame my role as a petty, bureaucratic nuisance. The department heads would shift uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking toward me, then away. And I would smile, a small, pleasant, unthreatening smile. I would nod and say, "Of course, Sable. I'll review the proposal and send over my notes." And then I would go back to my office with the view of the air conditioners, and I would save the meeting minutes to my server. I would cross-reference the proposal with the budget codes she was trying to circumvent. I would archive the email chain. I smiled, and I kept the emails, and I kept the receipts, and I kept the meeting schedules. I held the tension in every room like a gathering storm. They felt they were handing me every piece of evidence for my own downfall, not realizing I was patiently building the unshakable case that would ultimately ruin them. The ultimate irony was that my father gave me the final tool I needed, about a year ago. He handed me a key card to one of the corporate guest apartments in the exclusive Willow Row residences. "For your convenience," he'd said, "in case you work late and don't want to drive home, a place to freshen up." What he saw as a patronizing perk, I saw as an opportunity. The apartment was a ghost space, all beige furniture and soulless corporate art. It was also equipped with a commercial-grade fiber optic line. In the back of a walk-in closet, behind a rack of unworn bathrobes, sits a black, humming server tower. It is climate-controlled, encrypted, and completely off the Gray Line Meridian network. It is my digital fortress of solitude, the repository of every piece of evidence I had gathered. He gave me a cage, and I turned it into an armory. My gaze drifted from my father's back to the far wall of the lobby. Hanging there, in a place of honor, was their wedding photograph. It was an enormous, professionally shot portrait, encased in a heavy, dark walnut frame. They stood on a rolling green hill, the golden light of sunset catching in Sable's hair. They looked regal, untouchable, perfect. I remembered a night, 6 months ago, when I'd stayed late under the pretext of finishing a quarterly report. The lobby was empty, silent save for the whisper of the ventilation. I'd taken a tiny pinhole camera from my bag, the kind used in espionage films. I spent an hour testing angles, finally discovering that the reflection in the protective glass over their wedding portrait offered a perfect, slightly distorted, but clear view of the coat rack and the benches in front of it, a blind spot in the building's primary security coverage. I'd installed the camera in a discreet ceiling fixture opposite the photo. Now, standing here, the cold of the ice pack a dull ache in my palm. The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision. The public facade, captured in that ludicrously expensive photograph on the wall, and the private violence, which had just occurred in the camera's hidden field of view. The family that looked so perfect was a lie. Sable's assault, my father's complicity, my pain. It was all real. And now, thanks to them, it was all on the record. People see power as a loud, dramatic force, a gavel strike, a shouted order, a hostile takeover. They are wrong. True power is quiet. It is boring. It is found in the dense, mind-numbing text of a 50-page policy document that no one bothers to read. It is hidden in the footnotes of a contract, in the subclauses of a corporate bylaw, in the metadata of a signed PDF. My father and Sable chased the loud, visible kind of power. I had spent the last 18 months cultivating the quiet kind. It started with something as mundane as the company's travel and expense policy. The old one was a relic, full of loopholes you could drive a corporate jet through. Last year, I initiated a complete overhaul under the guise of modernizing our fiscal controls for enhanced shareholder confidence. It was the kind of project everyone supports in principle and ignores in practice. I spent weeks rewriting it. My language precise, surgical, tucked into Section 4, subsection C, was a new provision. Any and all wellness-related expenditures exceeding $25,000 would require not just a line-item invoice but also a corresponding vendor of record code to be cross-referenced with our pre-approved supplier database. It was a simple, logical control designed to prevent fraud. It was also a custom-built cage. The beauty of corporate bureaucracy is its ability to induce a state of profound apathy. I presented the final draft of the new policy for executive sign-off during an emergency board meeting in March. The official topic was a sudden downturn in our European market share, and tensions were high. My father was agitated, Sable was impatient, and the rest of the C-suite just wanted the meeting to end. I was the last item on the agenda. I kept my presentation brief. Using bland charts and corporate jargon, I clicked through the slides, my voice a steady monotone. When I finished, I placed the signature-ready PDF on the conference room's main monitor. Sable, as COO, will need your signature to ratify this, I said calmly. She didn't even look up from her phone. Is it standard? She asked, her thumb scrolling through what was probably a social media feed. It incorporates all the latest best practices for a company of our size and public standing, I replied, which was technically true. Fine, she waved a dismissive hand. Send it over. An e-signature request was dispatched to her tablet. A moment later, a notification pinged on my laptop. Ratified. I immediately took a high-resolution screenshot of her digital signature, complete with its timestamp, and embedded it as a non-editable object into the final, archived version of the policy document. She had signed her name to a set of rules she had no intention of following, and I had the receipt. The next layer was more complex. It involved the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, the ESOP. As part of an annual review, I proposed an addendum to address potential risks associated with executive conduct. I titled it the Fiduciary Integrity Protocol, another name designed to be both impressive and forgettable. Buried within the legalese was what I privately called the Bad Actor Clause. It stipulated that any officer of the company who became the subject of a formal internal investigation for harassment, assault, or gross misuse of company funds would have their voting rights, tied to their executive stock options, temporarily and automatically suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The power of a COO like Sable didn't just come from her title, it came from the weight of the shares she controlled. This clause was a direct link between her personal behavior and her corporate power. It passed the Legal Review Committee unanimously. No one wants to be the executive who votes against a fiduciary integrity protocol. Even their marriage contract was a potential weapon. I hadn't written it, of course. That was handled by a team of high-priced family law attorneys. But my father's lawyers, knowing my role in the company, had consulted me. They asked for my professional opinion on clauses that might intersect with corporate governance. I was granted the right to advise on the section pertaining to compliance and brand impact. At my suggestion, they strengthened the language of the honor clawback provision. It was a standard feature in prenuptial agreements for the wealthy, designed to protect assets in the case of infidelity. I helped them expand the definition. The clause now stipulated that any public act by either party that resulted in significant and demonstrable harm to the brand reputation or market value of Gray Line Meridian would trigger an immediate clawback of assets transferred during the marriage. An affair was one thing, a public scandal was another. I made sure the contract treated the latter as the more expensive offense. All of this architecture needed data to function, and for that, I had my sanctuary at Willow Row. The server in the closet was more than just a backup drive. It was the heart of a bespoke whistleblower system I had built from the ground up. I coded it myself, using multiple layers of encryption and routing the anonymous submission portal through a series of offshore proxies. An email went out to all employees, announcing a new, enhanced and confidential channel for reporting ethical concerns, assuring them of absolute protection from retaliation under company policy, a policy I had also rewritten. The submissions started as a trickle, then became a steady stream. A junior accountant in accounts payable flagged an invoice from the Cielo Vista retreat for $146,200. The memo line read, "Executive Team Offsite," but the dates corresponded exactly to the week Sable and my father took an unannounced vacation to Mexico, which they later passed off as an extended honeymoon. There was no executive team. There was no offsite. It was theft, gift-wrapped in a PDF invoice. Another report came from a graphic designer who had been forced to work with an outside photography company called Green Harbor Media. The contract was for an absurd $85,000 for a simple series of executive headshots. The designer thought the quality was poor and the price exorbitant. A little digging on my part revealed that Green Harbor Media was a registered LLC with a single officer, a man who shared a last name and a hometown with Sable's mother. It was her cousin's shell company. She was funneling company money to her family. Each report, each invoice, each piece of evidence was downloaded, categorized, and stored on the Willow Row server. I built a case file, complete with cross-referenced exhibits and a timeline of offenses. It was a quiet, methodical process of demolition. The final technical elements were the cameras and the audio. The evidence had to be unimpeachable. I made sure the pinhole camera I'd installed, the building's primary security cameras, and the recording app on my phone were all synced to the same network time protocol server. In a legal dispute, mismatched timestamps can be used to cast doubt on the authenticity of evidence. My evidence would be synchronized down to the millisecond, the video from the ceiling, the audio from my phone on the bench, and the time displayed on the screen in the elevator would all tell the exact same story. It would establish a perfect, unbroken chain of custody, the legal standard required to prove that evidence has not been tampered with. For months, the entire system lay dormant, a vast and complex machine waiting for a single switch to be thrown. I had the policies, signed and ratified. I had the legal clauses, embedded and approved. I had the financial evidence of her fraud, encrypted and archived. I had a secure and anonymous network of informants. I had the means to capture an event with legally admissible, time-synchronized precision. Everything was in place. The box was built, the lock was on the lid, and the key was in my hand. I was only missing one thing. I needed a catalyst. I needed a moment so public, so undeniable, that it would force the entire system into motion. I needed an act that could not be explained away, could not be buried in a settlement, could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Standing in that lobby, the pain in my collarbone a sharp, insistent metronome, I finally had it. Sable's fist, connecting with my body in full view of a security camera and in range of a live microphone, was not an attack, it was a confession. And I had been waiting a very long time to hear it. The assault in the lobby was not an accident, it was an engineered event, the culmination of a week of careful, calculated provocation, designed to push a volatile personality past a predictable breaking point. A controlled demolition requires not just explosives, but a precise and well-placed detonator. I had spent the week building one. The process began 4 days before the gala, with an email sent from my work account at 8:03 a.m. It was addressed to Sable, with the chief financial officer and the head of our internal audit department copied. The subject line was deliberately anodyne. Query re Q3 Wellness Expense Reconciliation. In the body of the email, I was polite, professional, and surgically precise. I referenced 6 specific invoices, all from the wellness budget, that had been flagged for non-compliance during the quarterly review. They lacked the vendor of record codes required by the policy she herself had signed. I listed them by invoice number, date, and amount. There was the Cielo Vista retreat, of course, and the Green Harbor media contract. There were 4 others, smaller but just as fraudulent. A leadership consultation with a life coach who was also her sister, a bulk purchase of high-end yoga equipment delivered to her home address, and 2 chartered flights logged as team transport. I ended the email with a simple, non-confrontational request. Could you please provide the necessary documentation for these items so that we may close out the Q3 books? Per policy, we cannot approve these expenditures for payment without the required codes. I knew how she would react. Sable viewed any form of oversight not as a corporate necessity, but as a personal insult. To be questioned, especially with others copied on the email, would be an intolerable affront to her authority. Her response came 12 minutes later. It was sent only to me. The CFO and the auditor were removed from the chain. It contained a single, imperious sentence. Approve it or resign. It was more perfect than I could have hoped. It was a direct order to violate company policy, a clear attempt at coercion, and an implicit threat of retaliation. I saved the email as a PDF, archived it on the Willow Row server, and then forwarded a copy to my personal, encrypted email address. It was Exhibit A. My next move was to schedule a meeting. I went into the corporate calendar and booked Room 29B, a glass-walled conference room on the executive floor, for the following Monday at 9:00 a.m. sharp. The title of the meeting was Quarterly Transparency Report. The attendee list included my father, the entire executive committee, and the heads of legal, HR, and internal audit, and crucially, I checked the box to enable internal live streaming of the meeting for all employees. It was an unusual but not unprecedented step, one I justified in the meeting notes as being in the interest of promoting our core value of corporate transparency. It was a dare. A public stage was being set. The gala was the final piece. I knew they would both be there. I knew Sable would have been drinking. I knew her anger over my email would have been simmering for days. I planned my movements that evening with the precision of a choreographer. I stayed late, ensuring most of the guests would have departed. I initiated the conversation about invoices with the event manager, and when I saw Sable approaching, I deliberately angled my body and maneuvered our conversation so that we were standing in the one precise spot in the lobby that I knew was covered by 3 different camera angles: the building's main overhead feed, the wide angle from the pinhole camera across the room, and the profile view from the security camera above the elevator bank. I positioned myself directly beneath the coat rack, a location that offered no ambiguity, no easy escape. I was bait, and I had chosen my own trap. After the assault, after my father's damning words, my first stop was not my office or my apartment. It was the small, sterile medical office on the mezzanine level, staffed 24/7 by an on-call corporate nurse. Her name was Linda, a kind, no-nonsense woman in her 50s. She listened patiently as I explained, in calm, factual terms, that I had been struck by another executive. Her professionalism was a shield, her expression betraying nothing but medical concern. She examined my collarbone under a bright, clinical light. "There's significant contusion and swelling," she said, her fingers gently probing the area. "It's going to be a very dark bruise." "I need you to document it, Linda," I said. "For the record." She nodded, understanding immediately. She took out the clinic's digital camera, the one used for documenting workplace injury claims. The flash was startlingly bright in the quiet room. She took 3 photos from different angles. She then had me sign a form, and she wrote a brief, objective report detailing her physical findings, the time of the examination, and my statement. She printed a copy for me. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. Back in my office on the 27th floor, I scanned the nurse's report and the photos. I attached them to a new email. It was a formal incident report. I cited the specific section of the Gray Line Meridian Employee Handbook that defined workplace violence and outlined the mandatory reporting protocol, a section I had personally rewritten 9 months prior. I detailed the events, named Sable as the assailant and my father as a witness, and attached the signed medical report. I sent it to the head of Human Resources, and I CC'd the company's general counsel. I hit send at 11:52 p.m. The corporate machine, my machine, began to turn. I knew what would happen next, because I had designed the gears. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, an automated notification from the legal department's software was sent to the IT department. A formal investigation had been initiated, which triggered an immediate, non-negotiable litigation hold. A team from IT would be dispatched to secure all of Sable's company-issued devices, her laptop, her phone, her tablet. Her email account would be frozen, and a forensic copy would be made of all her data. She was now a subject in an investigation, and her digital life at Gray Line Meridian was a crime scene. Simultaneously, the HR director, bound by the policies I'd written, had no choice but to trigger the fiduciary integrity protocol, the bad actor clause. A notification was sent to the board of directors and the firm that managed our ESOP. Effective immediately, the voting rights attached to the office of the interim COO were suspended in a single, silent, electronic transaction. Sable's primary source of power at the company was neutralized. She wouldn't even know it had happened until she tried to use it. My final step was to protect the data. In my apartment at Willow Row, I accessed the server. The audio file from my phone and the video from the pinhole camera had already been uploaded automatically. I compiled everything: the audio, the video, the financial fraud reports, the threatening email, the whistleblower submissions, the medical report, into a single, multi-layered encrypted container file. I then transferred a complete copy of this container to a small, solid-state drive. It was a cold storage backup, completely disconnected from any network. I locked the drive using a FIDO key, a physical hardware authenticator that looked like a simple USB stick. Without that physical key, the data on the drive was nothing more than unintelligible digital noise. The master key to Sable's destruction now existed in physical form, and it was in my pocket. My work was done. The traps were set. The evidence was secured. The dominoes were lined up, waiting for the first one to be pushed. I opened my calendar and looked at the entry for the coming Monday, 9:00 a.m., quarterly transparency report. I created a new alert for that appointment, setting it for 1 minute before the start time, 8:59 a.m. In the notes field for the alert, I typed 2 words: activate disclosure. News of a formal investigation, even a confidential one, does not remain confidential for long in a place like Braxton Point. The building itself seems to have a circulatory system for information, a network of whispers that flows through break rooms, chat clients, and the silent, shared glances in an elevator. The weekend between the gala and the Monday meeting was a period of intense, quiet activity. The machine I had set in motion was beginning to grind, and as it did, the people who had felt safe in Sable's orbit began to feel a sudden, uncomfortable heat. The first to reach out was Arthur Vance, our head of communications. He requested a video call on Saturday morning. He appeared on my screen from what looked like a home office, a carefully curated backdrop of leather-bound books, and a single, elegant orchid. Arthur was a man who spoke exclusively in narratives and optics. "Rhea," he began, his voice smooth and conciliatory, "I've been made aware of the situation. I want to assure you that we're getting ahead of this. We're preparing a communications strategy." "A strategy for what exactly, Arthur?" I asked, keeping my own face a placid mask. "For containment," he said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "We'll frame this as an unfortunate but private family matter, a deeply personal conflict that regrettably spilled over into a professional setting. We'll emphasize de-escalation and resolution." He was proposing a lie, a comfortable, corporate fairy tale to soothe the market and the board. He saw a PR problem to be managed, not a crime to be addressed. "A personal conflict?" I repeated the words slowly, letting them hang in the air. "Arthur, the incident report I filed cites Section 3.4 of the Employee Conduct Policy, which defines workplace violence. The investigation is a corporate matter, not a family one." He waved a dismissive hand. "Semantics, Rhea, we need to control the narrative before it controls us." "There's another document you might want to read," I said, my voice dropping a little. "It's the Corporate Whistleblower and Anti-Retaliation Policy. I updated it last year. It outlines the severe legal and financial penalties for any attempt to suppress, intimidate, or recharacterize a formal complaint of this nature. Have you read it?" A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even fear, passed through his eyes. The smooth, confident mask slipped for just a fraction of a second. He knew exactly what I was talking about. Framing a formal assault complaint as a personal conflict could easily be construed as an attempt to suppress it. He was a potential accessory. "I'll have my team review it," he stammered, his posture suddenly rigid. The call ended a few moments later. The narrative was no longer his to control. The next message arrived that afternoon. It was a private text from David Chenning, the chief financial officer. David was a nervous, perpetually cautious man who had prospered by never making a decision that could be traced solely back to him. His loyalty was not to a person, but to the path of least resistance. His text read, "Rhea, I am deeply concerned. For everyone's sake, let's not let this escalate. There has to be a way to resolve this quietly. Don't push things too far." It was a plea from a man who felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He had stood by my father's side at the gala, a silent witness. He had signed off on Sable's expense accounts. Choosing to ignore the obvious red flags, he was complicit. I didn't text him back. Instead, I opened my laptop and composed a new email to his official work address. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained a single hyperlink. It was a direct, read-only link to a specific subledger on the company's internal accounting portal. The link opened to the detailed transaction record for the Cielo Vista retreat. It showed the date, the amount, the fraudulent memo line, and, at the bottom, the 2 digital signatures required for approval of any non-budgeted expenditure over $100,000. The first was Sable Rowan. The second, timestamped 2 hours later, was David Chenning. I hit send. I knew he would receive the notification on his phone. I imagined him opening the email, clicking the link, and seeing his own name, in stark black and white, irrevocably tied to her fraud. I had not made a threat. I had not made an accusation. I had simply sent him a fact that proved his concern was not for everyone's sake, but solely for his own. I received no further texts from him. On Sunday, I got a call from Michael Croft, our general counsel. He wanted to meet in person, suggesting a quiet coffee shop downtown. I declined, insisting on a video call. When his face appeared, it was etched with a practiced, lawyerly solemnity. "Rhea, I've reviewed your report," he said, his voice a low baritone. "This is a highly sensitive situation. Given the family dynamics, I believe the best path forward is a mediated family solution. We can handle this internally, without the formalities." He was offering me a settlement, a quiet payout, a non-disclosure agreement, a return to the status quo. He was offering to protect my father and his wife, at the expense of the company and the law. "Michael," I said, my voice cool and even, "we are a publicly traded company with a fiduciary duty to our shareholders. A violent assault by an officer on another employee, followed by years of systematic embezzlement, is not a family dynamic. It's a catastrophic failure of governance, and we will be addressing it according to the formalities." "Your father," he started to say. "My father is the CEO," I interrupted, "and his obligations are the same as mine. This is not about the veils. This is about Gray Line Meridian." He stared at me for a long moment, the gears turning behind his eyes. He was recalibrating, realizing that his usual playbook was useless here. "I see," he said finally, his tone turning frosty. "I'll proceed accordingly." He understood. I was not the daughter, I was the chief compliance officer, and I was building a case. As if on cue, a new alert pinged in my secure whistleblower portal. It was an anonymous submission. The message was brief. "You might find this interesting," from the COO's inner circle. Attached was a series of screenshots from a private group chat. The chat was named Wellness Achieved. The screenshots showed Sable's executive assistant and a few of her loyal managers celebrating after the approval of the Cielo Vista expense. There were photos of champagne flutes, celebratory emojis, and one message from the assistant that read, "Another successful wellness initiative in the books. Sable is a genius." It was a digital smoking gun, a clear admission of their conspiracy. I traced the metadata of the submission. It came from a junior administrative assistant in the marketing department, a young woman who was often tasked with running errands for Sable's team. She was terrified, but she was also principled. I immediately activated the protocol. I sent her a secure, anonymous message back through the portal, confirming receipt and thanking her for her courage. I informed her that she was now officially classified as a protected whistleblower. I arranged for an IT technician I trusted to go to her desk after hours and replace her laptop with a new, clean one, citing a hardware refresh program. I had her access card privileges updated, giving her a temporary card that restricted her access to the executive floor, for her own protection. Finally, I put in a request with HR to have her workstation relocated to a different department on a different floor, effective Monday morning, under the pretext of a departmental restructuring. By the time Sable realized what was happening, her potential target would be gone, shielded by the very policies I had put in place. The first tremors of Sable's isolation began to show on the corporate calendar. Late Sunday evening, two of the managers from the Wellness Achieved group chat, men who owed their recent promotions entirely to Sable, quietly declined the invitation to the Monday morning transparency meeting. It was an act of cowardice, an attempt to distance themselves from their patroness. But it was also a sign. The rats were beginning to scope out the ship. I smiled. They could decline the meeting, but the system still kept a running tally of who was watching the live stream. Their absence in the room would be just as conspicuous as their presence. My final preparation was a simple one. I called the facilities department and asked them to set up an additional 20 chairs in conference room 29B. "But the meeting only has 12 confirmed attendees," the manager said, confused. "I'm expecting a larger audience on the stream," I said, "and I want to make sure there are seats available for any of our smaller, individual shareholders who might decide to visit the headquarters tomorrow morning. They're often forgotten, and I think it's important they feel welcome." It was a symbolic gesture, but a potent one. I was preparing the room not for an executive slap on the wrist, but for a public reckoning, and I wanted everyone, especially the people the company so often ignored, to have a front row seat. The weekend was over, the stage was set. At Braxton Point, rumors travel faster than the elevators, and by Monday morning, everyone knew that something was about to break. They just didn't know how cleanly I planned to make the cut. The air in conference room 29B was cold and still. The room was a glass box on the top floor of the world, offering a panoramic view of the city waking below. Inside, the dozen executives sat around the long, polished granite table like figures in a diorama. My father was at the head of the table, his face a mask of stern neutrality. Sable sat to his right, radiating a palpable aura of indignation and contempt. She had come for a fight, believing it would be a battle of wills. She was wrong. This was not a battle, it was a dissection. I sat at the opposite end of the table, my laptop open in front of me. The large screen on the wall behind me was blank. The small red light on the ceiling-mounted camera indicated the live stream was active. On a monitor to my right, I could see the viewer count: 217, 248, 312. It was climbing steadily. The entire company was watching. My calendar alert chimed softly on my phone. 8:59 a.m. I took a sip of water, the silence in the room broken only by the faint, almost subliminal hum of the building's HVAC system. Then, I pressed the button to begin the presentation. The screen behind me flickered to life. The first slide was intentionally, painfully dull, a dark blue background with white text. In the center, in a stark, sans serif font, were 3 words: transactions, $25,000. I saw a few shoulders around the table relax slightly. A budget review. This was familiar territory. David Chenning, the CFO, even picked up his pen, ready to take notes. Sable smirked, a small, triumphant curl of her lips, as if to say, "This is your big move? A spreadsheet?" I let the slide sit there for exactly 15 seconds, then I clicked to the next one. The screen went black, and then it exploded with light and sound. It was the lobby from Friday night, the amber lighting casting everything in a sickly, dramatic glow. The video was a composite cut from 3 different angles, edited together with timestamps in the bottom corner. It began with the wide-angle shot from the pinhole camera, showing Sable's approach. Then it cut to a tighter shot from the main security feed as she threw the keycard. The audio, crisp and clear from my phone's recording, filled the silent room. Her voice, sharp and laced with venom. "Don't ruin my evening with your spreadsheets, Rhea." The scene played out in brutal, high-definition clarity. The grab, the drag to the coat rack, her words. "You're nothing but a glorified bean counter." Then, the sharp, percussive sound of the blow, followed by the dull thud of my head hitting the iron rack. The video cut to a close-up from the elevator camera, capturing the shock on the faces of the junior associates. Then, the final, damning piece. The audio focused on my father's voice, low and guttural. "Not in public." The video froze on a still frame of my father turning his back, his face a mask of cold fury, not at his wife's violence, but at my public victimhood. In the lower right corner of the screen, a small, official-looking seal appeared, with the words, "Chain of Custody Certified, NTP Synchronized." The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The hum of the HVAC suddenly sounded like a jet engine. Someone near me, I think it was the head of HR, let out a shaky, audible breath that was picked up by the sensitive microphones on the table and broadcast to the hundreds of employees watching. No one moved. They were all staring at the screen, at the ugly, undeniable truth of what had happened in their lobby. I swiveled my chair to face them, my own expression impassive. I picked up the microphone in front of me. "According to Section 3.4 of the Gray Line Meridian Employee Conduct Policy," I began, my voice even and devoid of emotion, "the act you have just witnessed is defined as Level 4 workplace violence. According to the Fiduciary Integrity Protocol, Addendum B of the Employee Stock Ownership Plan, any officer who is the subject of a formal investigation into such an act is subject to immediate and automatic suspension of all voting rights associated with their executive position." My words landed like stones in a still pond. The legal architecture I had so patiently constructed was now visible to everyone. This wasn't a family squabble. It was a clear, unambiguous violation of corporate law. "This is bullshit!" Sable's voice was a shriek. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was a mottled mask of rage and disbelief. "You set me up. This is a lie. You staged this entire thing." I didn't look at her. I simply clicked the remote in my hand. The video on the screen was replaced by a new slide. It was a high-resolution scan of the invoice from the Cielo Vista retreat, $146,200. The fraudulent memo line, "Executive team offsite," was highlighted in red. Click, the next slide, the $85,000 contract for Green Harbor Media. A second red box highlighted the name of the LLC's sole officer. A third box showed his publicly available family records, linking him directly to Sable. Click, the screenshots from the Wellness Achieved group chat, the champagne flutes, the message from her assistant. Click, a spreadsheet, detailing every single one of the fraudulent transactions, totaling over $500,000 in misused corporate funds over the past year. I looked at David Chenning. A sheen of sweat had broken out on his forehead. His face had gone pale, the color of old parchment. He was staring at the screen, at the evidence of the crimes he had enabled with his silence and his signature. "This is highly irregular," Michael Croft, the general counsel, interjected, finding his voice at last. He stood up, smoothing his suit jacket in a useless gesture of control. "I suggest we take a recess. This discussion should be had in a more private setting." "No," I said, my voice cutting through his. I looked directly at him. "We are not taking a recess. We are not moving to a private setting. We don't take a recess from the truth. Michael, the time for privacy is over." My gaze shifted to my father. He was staring at me, and for the first time since this had begun, I saw something other than anger or annoyance in his eyes. It was a look of dawning horror. The carefully constructed world he had built for himself was collapsing, in real time, on a live stream. He was not in control. He had never been in control. I made my final move. On my laptop, I opened a new file. It was a formal, legally drafted petition. I addressed the General Counsel and the Board of Directors. The document officially requested the activation of the honor clawback provision from my father and Sable's prenuptial agreement, citing demonstrable harm to the brand. I attached a copy of my formal HR complaint and Linda the nurse's medical report as exhibits. With the entire meeting as my witness, I digitally signed the document and clicked send. A notification popped up on Michael Croft's laptop. It was done. It was part of the official record. The financial implications of that single email were devastating. It would not just end their marriage, it would financially unravel it. The wealth she had gained, the assets he had transferred, would all be subject to seizure. My father's eyes were locked on mine. He saw the notification on the lawyer's screen. He understood what I had just done. The corporate attack was one thing. This was a move against him, against his personal life, against the woman he had chosen. His lips parted, and he spoke my name. It was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the tense, silent room, but the microphone picked it up clearly. "Rhea." It was a plea, a question, a surrender, all of it. I leaned forward, my mouth just inches from the microphone. I looked at my father, the man who had taught me that appearances were everything, that the only real crime was getting caught, and I gave him my answer. The 2 words he had given me now returned to him with the full weight of the law, the cameras, and the entire company behind them. In public. The words "in public" settled over the room, not with the force of a shout, but with the dead, absolute weight of a verdict. My father flinched as if struck, his face ashen. Sable stood frozen, her mouth slightly agape, the fury in her eyes momentarily replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. They had expected tears, arguments, a messy, emotional confrontation they could twist and control. They were not prepared for the cold, unyielding mechanics of the law. They still believed they were in a family drama. I was about to inform them they were attending a corporate execution. "That brings me to my final point," I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. I clicked the remote, and a new slide appeared on the screen. It was a scanned document, dense with legal text. I had highlighted a single section. The title of the document was Addendum 7, Key Person Continuity Protocol. This addendum to the corporate bylaws was ratified by the board 19 months ago, As part of our annual governance review, I explained calmly, my voice amplified by the microphone. Most of you likely signed it without reading. It's a standard continuity of operations clause, designed to protect the company in the event of a sudden leadership crisis. I paused, letting them read the highlighted text. Specifically, it states that in the event of a significant, publicly disclosed reputational crisis, I gestured vaguely toward the frozen image of the assault still visible on a side monitor, and if the chief executive officer is found to be temporarily incapacitated or otherwise unable to execute emergency decisions, the authority to appoint or replace the chief operating officer transfers immediately and exclusively to the Compliance Committee. A low murmur rippled through the room. My father's eyes narrowed. He was finally understanding. "That's absurd," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I am the CEO. I am not incapacitated." "The Compliance Committee consists of 3 members," I continued, ignoring him. "The General Counsel, an independent board director, and the Chief Compliance Officer, who serves as chair. A simple majority of 2 votes is required to pass a motion." I turned my gaze to Michael Croft, the General Counsel, who looked as if he'd just swallowed ice. Then I looked at the video conference screen where our one truly independent director, a formidable retired judge named Evelyn Reed, was watching with keen, intelligent eyes. "As for the matter of incapacitation," I said, clicking to my final slide, "this is a copy of a medical report filed with Human Resources at 7:00 a.m. this morning by your cardiologist, Dr. Alistair Finch." The slide showed a doctor's note, concise and clinical. It stated that due to a recently diagnosed cardiac arrhythmia, Mr. Grant Vale had been prescribed a potent beta blocker and a secondary sedative to manage stress. The report noted that for a period of at least 72 hours, a period which neatly covered the gala and the present moment, the patient was medically advised against making high-stress, critical decisions due to potential cognitive impairment. The note was a standard fitness for duty update, a legal requirement for a public company CEO with a known health issue. Dr. Finch had been protecting his patient and his own license. In doing so, he had handed me the keys to the kingdom. According to this medical record, submitted by your own physician, you are, by legal and medical definition, temporarily unfit to command during a crisis, I stated flatly, which means the power to address the now vacant COO position falls to the committee. It falls to me. My father stared at the screen, at the betrayal written in his doctor's prescription notes. He looked utterly defeated. I didn't wait for his response. I addressed the screen. "Judge Reed, you have seen the evidence presented this morning. I am now calling a vote of the Compliance Committee. I move to appoint Jonah Bell, our current head of internal audit, as interim chief operating officer, effective immediately. All in favor?" I raised my hand. In her small box on the screen, Judge Reed's hand went up without a moment's hesitation. Her expression was grim but resolute. She was a woman of law, and the law was clear. Michael Croft abstained. Looking helplessly at my father, it didn't matter. The vote was 2-1. It was done. "The motion carries," I announced. "Jonah Bell is appointed interim COO. Please have security and IT act accordingly." The effect was instantaneous. My phone buzzed with a text from the head of the building security, a man I had briefed on the potential outcomes. It read, "Rowan access credentials demoted to visitor status. Effective now." Sable looked at her own phone, a notification of the change no doubt appearing on her screen. A look of pure animal panic crossed her face. She was locked out. Arthur Vance, the PR head, finally snapped out of his stupor. "We can't let this get out. We need to shut down the stream, issue a statement about a restructuring." "No," a new voice said. It was Jonah Bell, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, his face unreadable until now. He stood up, a tall, impeccably dressed man whose entire career had been built on finding and exposing the kind of fraud I had just laid bare. "You will do no such thing. Arthur, you will issue one statement, and one statement only." Jonah walked to the head of the table. standing in the space beside my father. He looked directly into the live stream camera. The statement will say that Gray Line Meridian has a zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence and the misuse of corporate funds. It will say that Sable Rowan is no longer with the company and that I have been appointed interim COO to ensure a swift and thorough investigation. It will say that we are a company of laws, not of people. Is that clear? Arthur Vance simply nodded, speechless. I was already typing a new email. It was a formal notification to the NASDAQ exchange. It informed them of a material change in the company's executive leadership and the reasons for it. It was a necessary step to prevent insider trading and ensure market transparency. I sent it before anyone could stop me. And then, something remarkable happened. In the back of the room, in the extra chairs I had set out, a few of the small, individual shareholders who had shown up were standing. One of them, an elderly man in a worn suit, began to clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a slow, deliberate applause. He was soon joined by another, and then another. It was the sound of recognition, the sound of people who had been ignored for years, finally seeing someone who had bothered to read the fine print, who had used the rules not to enrich themselves, but to protect the integrity of the company they all owned a small piece of. The applause seemed to break Sable's trance. With a guttural scream of pure rage, she lunged toward me. Before she could take 2 steps, 2 security guards, who had been standing discreetly by the door, stepped in her path. They didn't touch her, but their presence was an immovable wall. She was escorted from the room, still screaming threats and obscenities. The glass doors to the conference room slid shut, and she was left in the hallway outside, pounding on the glass. We could see her face, contorted in a mask of fury, her mouth forming words we could no longer hear. The microphones in the room were designed to isolate the sound around the table, to filter out any external noise. Her rage was rendered completely, totally silent. All the power she had ever wielded, the power of her voice, her anger, her presence, was gone. She was just a woman screaming behind soundproof glass. The live stream camera, mounted on the ceiling, captured the entire tableau with cold, impartial clarity. Sable, a silent, raging figure trapped outside. My father, a broken man, sitting motionless at the head of his own table. Jonah Bell, the new COO, calmly giving orders, and me, the architect of it all, watching as the final piece of my design clicked perfectly into place. It was a static, silent picture of a dynasty's end. The live stream ended. The viewer count on my monitor vanished, plunging the room into a thick, ringing silence that was somehow louder than the shouting that had preceded it. The extra chairs I had ordered now looked like tombstones in a freshly filled graveyard. Sable was gone from the hallway window. My father hadn't moved. He sat at the head of the table, a king on a chessboard who had just realized he was in checkmate, surrounded by pieces he no longer controlled. Jonah Bell, the newly minted interim COO, broke the stillness. He picked up a tablet from the table and walked over to where my father and Sable's personal lawyer, a man named Harris, were conferring in frantic whispers with Michael Croft. "Gentlemen," Jonah's voice was calm, devoid of triumph. It was the voice of an auditor stating an inarguable sum. "Before Ms. Rowan leaves the premises, we need to address the matter of restitution." He turned the tablet so Harris could see the screen. "This is a preliminary audit of the expenses approved under the so-called Wellness Initiative. The current total of misappropriated funds is $612,400. The company will be formally demanding the immediate repayment of that principal amount." Harris scoffed. "My client will contest." "Furthermore," Jonah continued, as if the lawyer hadn't spoken, "pursuant to the penalties outlined in the corporate expense policy, the one Ms. Rowan ratified in March, a financial penalty of 200% of the misappropriated amount will be levied. That brings the total amount due to Gray Line Meridian to $1,837,200. We expect a proposal for a payment schedule within 48 hours. The number hung in the air, a physical weight. It was a debt designed to crush. Before Harris could sputter another objection, Michael Croft cleared his throat, his face pale. He was looking at my father, but his words were for Sable's lawyer. There is another matter. He slid a leather-bound document across the table. It was a copy of the prenuptial agreement. The petition to activate the honor clawback provision has been accepted by Mr. Vale's counsel, Croft said, his voice a monotone of defeat. The evidence of demonstrable harm to the brand is, as we've all seen, overwhelming. The clause is in effect as of 9:07 a.m. this morning. He tapped a specific paragraph with his finger. All assets, holdings, and properties transferred to Ms. Rowan during the term of the marriage are to be reverted to Mr. Vale's premarital trust. This includes the deed to the Aspen property, the title for the Aston Martin, and the entire contents of the joint investment portfolio. It was a total financial annihilation. The company was taking her fraudulent earnings, and the contract was taking her marital ones. In the space of 10 minutes, she had gone from being one of the wealthiest women in the city to being deeply and catastrophically in debt. A commotion at the door drew our attention. Sable had returned, flanked by 2 security guards who kept a respectful but firm distance. She had managed to convince them to let her retrieve her personal handbag. Her face was a storm of fury. She ignored the lawyers, ignored Jonah. Her eyes were fixed on my father. "You," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You let her do this. You just sat there. You traitor." My father looked up at her, his expression weary, ancient. He looked like a man who had aged a decade in an hour. All the fight was gone from him, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He shook his head slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. I said not in public. It was the most honest and the most damning thing he had ever said. He wasn't sorry for the fraud, or the lies, or the violence. He was sorry they had been exposed. The shame was his only currency. I looked at him, at this man whose moral compass had only one direction, inward. "That was the wrong thing to say," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the still room. "I wasn't wrong." His gaze snapped to me, a flicker of the old anger returning, but it died just as quickly. He had no response. The truth, for once, had left him speechless. Sable's head whipped around, her venomous glare now focused entirely on me. She took a step forward, and the guards tensed. "What do you want?" she hissed, the question raw and guttural. "What the hell do you want from me?" It was the question at the heart of everything. She thought I wanted revenge, or money, or her position. She could not comprehend the truth. "I want the company to be run by people who read the documents," I said. The simplicity of the answer seemed to break something in her. She stared at me, her mind unable to process a motive that wasn't rooted in greed or spite. She had been defeated not by a rival, but by a principle. "Ms. Rowan," one of the guards said, his voice polite but firm, "we need to escort you downstairs." She seemed to shrink, the fight draining out of her. She nodded numbly. As they turned to leave, she fumbled in her handbag and pulled out her corporate access card. She walked to the conference room door and held it against the scanner, a final, reflexive act of defiance. The light on the scanner blinked red once, and a low, negative buzz sounded. The card was dead. Her hand trembled as she lowered it, the small piece of useless plastic a perfect symbol of everything she had just lost. She dropped it on the floor and walked away without looking back. The moment she was gone, the room devolved into quiet, efficient procedure. An IT technician I had put on standby entered with a cart. I walked over to the table and picked up a form from a folder Michael Croft had brought. "Data preservation order. Sable Rowan." I signed my name at the bottom, my signature a crisp, clean line. "It's authorized," I said to the technician. He nodded and left, heading for her now empty office on the 29th floor. There, he would place official seals on her laptop, her desktop, her phone. He would begin the process of creating a forensic image of her server space. The machine would collect its evidence. The head of HR, a woman named Carol, who had looked horrified throughout the entire meeting, approached me, her expression a mixture of fear and professional duty. "Rhea," she said, her voice hushed. "In light of events, we'll be sending out a memo. We're offering confidential counseling services to any employees who may have been distressed by witnessing the incident on Friday or the contents of this meeting. It was the corporate solution to everything. Outsource the trauma. Sanitize the wound with a therapy session." "That's a good idea, Carol," I said. "Thank you." She nodded, relieved, and hurried away to draft her memo. I stood alone for a moment in the silent, empty conference room. The view of the city was clear and bright. It looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago. But everything had changed. The price had been paid. The debt had been collected. When Carol's email arrived in my inbox 20 minutes later, I opened it. It was full of gentle, therapeutic language about safe spaces and shared feelings. At the bottom was a link to a confidential sign-up form. I clicked it. I typed my name into the field and selected the first available appointment. It wasn't a gesture of weakness. It was a final, necessary act of compliance. I had done something monstrous, something necessary and cold and brutally efficient. I had held the line. I had read the documents. I had enforced the rules, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that being this strong, this right, this alone, required a witness. The journey from the 29th floor to the lobby is a silent, 30-second descent in a glass and steel box, for Sable. It must have felt like an eternity. I watched her on the security monitor in my office, a solitary figure in a crimson dress that now looked less like a statement of power and more like a wound. She stood perfectly still as the numbers above the elevator door counted down her life, her knuckles white where she gripped the handrail. She was being escorted out of the building by 2 guards, but they kept a professional distance, giving the illusion that she was leaving on her own terms. It was the last courtesy the company would ever extend her. Jonah Bell's press release had been a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. It was released to the wire services the moment Sable was voted out. There was no spin, no corporate euphemism. It stated the facts. An internal investigation into workplace violence and financial malfeasance had been launched. The interim COO had been terminated effective immediately, and the company had a zero-tolerance policy. By the time Sable's elevator doors slid open, the sharks were already circling. The lobby was no longer the quiet, amber-lit sanctuary of the gala. The morning sun streamed through the towering glass walls, cold and unforgiving, bleaching all the color from the marble floors, and it was filled with people, reporters, cameramen, local news anchors, a chaotic scrum of them held back by a hastily assembled line of security guards. They had materialized as if from thin air, drawn by the scent of a high-profile kill. The air crackled with their energy, a low hum of anticipation. The moment they saw her, the noise erupted, a barrage of shouted questions, the frantic clicking of camera shutters, the bright, disorienting pop of flashbulbs. Sable froze in the elevator doorway, blinking like a nocturnal creature dragged into the sun. The guards moved to form a V-shape in front of her, trying to clear a path to the revolving doors. But the press surged forward, a tide of microphones and lenses. "Ms. Rowan, is it true you've been fired? What is the nature of the investigation? Sable, over here. Can you give us a comment?" She tried to push through, her head held high, a reflexive act of defiance from a queen who hadn't yet realized she'd been deposed. Then, one reporter, a young woman with a sharp face and a sharper voice, broke through the noise. She shoved her microphone past a guard's arm, getting it just inches from Sable's face. "Ms. Rowan," the reporter's voice was clear and cutting, "is it true that you physically assaulted the CEO's daughter in this lobby on Friday night?" The question struck home. It wasn't about money or power. It was about the primal, personal act of violence. It was the one truth she couldn't spin. All the other shouted questions faded into a dull roar. This was the only one that mattered. Sable's head snapped toward the reporter, her carefully constructed mask of aristocratic disdain finally, completely shattered. A raw, guttural sound tore from her throat, a sound of pure, undiluted rage. "She is not my daughter!" she screamed, the words echoing through the cavernous space, a declaration of war against a bloodline she had failed to conquer. The camera flashes intensified, a strobing, silent storm, capturing the precise moment of her unraveling. And that was my cue. I had come down a separate elevator, emerging from the service corridor behind the main reception desk. I had been standing there, in the shadows, waiting. Now, I walked forward, my heels clicking softly on the marble, a sound that cut through the chaos. I didn't hurry. I moved with a deliberate, measured pace, and the sea of reporters parted for me as if by instinct. I stopped just behind Sable, to her left, placing myself beside the ornate, wrought-iron coat rack, the exact spot where it had all begun. The reporters turned, their lenses and microphones swiveling from her to me. A new wave of questions started, but I ignored them. I looked at Sable's reflection in the polished surface of a nearby pillar. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling, her face contorted. I held up a hand, a simple gesture for silence, and to my surprise, they gave it to me. I leaned toward the nearest microphone, the one the young reporter was still holding out. I didn't shout. I didn't need to. "She's right," I said, my voice calm and clear, amplified electronically for all to hear. "I am not her daughter." I paused, letting the words settle, letting the cameras find my face. I looked directly into the lens of a large broadcast camera, seeing not the man behind it, but the thousands of people watching at home, at their desks, in the company I had just saved. I am the chief compliance officer who authored the policy she violated. I am the person who signed the document that just stripped her of her power. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, a line item from the minutes of a meeting, and it was the most devastating thing I could have said. The last vestiges of Sable's control snapped. With a wordless roar, she lunged at me. It wasn't a calculated blow like the one she delivered on Friday. It was a wild, desperate swipe, the clawing attack of a cornered animal. She never reached me. The security guard to my right moved with fluid speed, stepping between us, his arm coming up to block her, his hand flat against her chest. He didn't push her. He simply absorbed her momentum. A human wall. The camera flashes went off in a blinding, continuous torrent, a silent explosion of light. Through it all, I saw my father. He had come down and was standing near the main entrance, by the large walnut-framed wedding photograph. He stood perfectly still, a statue in a bespoke suit. He didn't move to intervene. He didn't call out. He didn't react. He just watched, his eyes wide and unblinking, as the last ugly scene of his disastrous marriage played out for the entire world to see. He was a spectator at his own ruin. I took a step back from the chaos. Out of the immediate glare of the flashes, I looked past the reporters, past the security guards restraining a now sobbing Sable, and I found the main security camera on the ceiling, the same one I had stared at on Friday night. I looked straight into its dark, impersonal lens. "This company," I said, my voice rising just enough to be heard over the din, "belongs to the rules. It does not belong to the spectacle." It was a promise, a mission statement. Across the lobby, behind the long, polished curve of the reception desk, a young woman, a new hire, I vaguely recalled, was watching the entire scene, her eyes wide, as my words echoed in the sudden lull. She looked at me, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of understanding, of solidarity. It was everything. At that moment, as if directed by some unseen stagehand, the large revolving doors to the street spun open. A gust of cold, clean autumn air swept into the lobby. It swirled through the overheated, tense atmosphere, carrying with it the scent of rain and exhaust from the city outside. The wind was a cleansing force, and it seemed to blow away the last lingering traces of the cloying, artificial heat that Sable and my father had generated for so long. It blew out a flame that no one, not anymore, had any desire to keep lit. The spectacle was over. I returned to the glass box on the 29th floor. The room was empty now, save for Jonah, who was on his phone, his back to me, already directing the first steps of the company's new, uncorrupted life. The debris of the meeting, discarded pens, half-empty water glasses, the palpable residue of fear and adrenaline, was all that remained of the previous administration. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent business. Nothing had changed out there. Everything had changed in here. I walked to the head of the table, where my father had sat. A leather-bound folder was open in his place. It contained the official minutes of the meeting, automatically transcribed by the room's software. I read through the text. It was all there. A cold, factual account of the morning's events, the presentation of evidence, the votes, the terminations, the appointments. It was a perfect, sterile record of a bloody revolution. At the bottom of the last page was a line for my signature, as chair of the Compliance Committee, to attest to the accuracy of the record. I picked up a heavy, expensive fountain pen someone had left behind. The nib scratched softly against the thick paper, my name flowing onto the page in dark, permanent ink. It was the last document, the final, official word. I closed the leather cover. The soft thud echoed in the silent room. I placed the pen precisely on the edge of the table, parallel to the folder. Order restored. Jonah finished his call and turned to me. He nodded toward the folder. "It's a clean record." "It's a complete one," I corrected him. He offered a small, thin smile. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but of professional respect between two people who understood the power of a well-documented fact. "We'll proceed by the book from here on out," he said. It was a promise, a declaration of the new era. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below. "Publicly," I said. A chime, soft and distant, sounded from the elevator bank down the hall. We both knew what it was. Sable, her handbag full of useless keys and a phone that no longer connected to the corporate network, was leaving the building with her lawyer. There was no farewell party, no line of tearful employees, no golden parachute. There was only the quiet, anonymous hum of an elevator descending, carrying away a ghost. My father was standing by the door. He had been waiting for me. He looked smaller, diminished, a man hollowed out from the inside. He watched me as I approached, his eyes full of a chaotic mixture of emotions I couldn't begin to untangle. Anger, shame, regret, maybe even a sliver of pride. It was impossible to know. He opened his mouth, as if to say something. My name, perhaps, or a question, or an accusation. The words formed on his lips, but never found a voice. His mouth closed. He looked away, down at the plush carpeting, unable to meet my gaze. And in that silence, in that aborted sentence, I heard everything he could never say. I understood that there was nothing left between us but a shared last name and a history that was now officially on the record. I walked past him without a word. The lobby was quiet again. The reporters were gone, having gotten their story. The security staff was back to its calm, watchful state. The cold sunlight still streamed through the windows, but it felt less harsh now, more like a simple fact of the day. I walked over to the coat rack. My coat, a simple, dark wool trench, was still hanging there, forgotten in the chaos. I lifted it from the hook. As the fabric settled over my shoulders, I glanced in the polished surface of a nearby marble column. I could see the skin of my collarbone. The angry red mark from Friday night had faded, replaced by a pale, yellowish-green shadow, the ghost of a bruise already healing. The physical evidence was vanishing, but the truth it represented was now permanent, etched into the company's history. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of the coat familiar and comforting. I looked up. High on the ceiling, the small, dark dome of the security camera seemed to watch me. I saw my own reflection in its convex lens, a tiny, distorted figure of a woman, standing alone but perfectly, unshakably straight. I turned and walked toward the main elevator bank. I pushed the button. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh. I stepped inside. For a moment, I saw my own reflection in the polished steel of the closing doors. My face was calm. My hands, hanging at my sides, were perfectly still. They were no longer trembling. The doors slid shut, and the world outside was replaced by a soft, neutral light. The elevator began its silent descent. The screen went black. The end. Thank you so much for listening to the story. I'm always so curious to know where you all are tuning in from. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts on Ria's journey. So please share them. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help even more, you can support us by hitting the hype button. It really helps this story get heard by more people.